man loved a woman, a child it was born. It learned how to hurt and it learned how to cry like humans do.
Hi, I'm Tommy Rocket. Welcome to the 216th Tommy Rocket Show. As you know, I'm here with my co-host, Peter Phipps. He is an instructor of journalism at URI, and I am with Steve Hamburg. He is a forestry ecologist. Is that correct?
Forest ecologist.
Forest ecologist, yes. We're here with a great topic, which was Peter's choice, because, you know, today everybody's so interested in trees. Peter, tell me.
Well, it's driven by your guest.
Yes. What made you pick this topic?
Most of your work, a lot of your work now is with methane gas and things, but you've always been a tree guy.
I'm a tree guy.
Yeah. So I thought we'd start with a simple in praise of trees, all the things they do for us.
Sounds good.
So we made a list. I thought we'd start, what about pollution? How about trees and pollution?
Absolutely. Your best filter in the urban environment, which most of us here in Rhode Island live in, is putting trees around you, because they actually filter out the leaves, filter out the particulates, which is the major pollutant we have. So, for example, if somebody has a fire in their fireplace, and it's during, it won't normally, but if there are leaves on it, whether it's needles or whatever, those particles will be greatly reduced by the presence of the leaves that the air is blowing past.
So how does that work? Just as any kind of filter, or?
Well, it works. I mean, just think of it. You have hairs on the leaves, and you have the average tree will have 3 or 4 leaves for every bit of space. So they're overlapping. You don't just have them next to each other.
Is
they're
why
overlapping. Right, and they create a shade, and that way they want to try to capture all the light.
Yeah.
So the point is that all that air blows through, and they actually capture on the surface, they trap all those really small particles that get down into our lungs and do us damage.
Well, now,
really?
And carbon. They absorb carbon.
They absorb carbon. They are carbon. They're 50% carbon.
So how does that work? They pull there's CO2 in the air, they pull the carbon out of the air.
Well, they pull it out through photosynthesis.
Right.
So the main thing what's happening is, of course, is they're taking sunlight and water and producing carbohydrate, right? They're sugars. That's what they live on. So they're using the sun in order to pull and using CO2 to create a sugar, which is their food.
And they take the carbon out and they give us back the oxygen.
They give us back the oxygen. That's right.
So if you have a room in your house filled with plants, is it going to have a higher?
It could have some higher oxygen, but I mean, more importantly, is it's going to reduce the CO2 levels, because one of the problems we have if we're in a house and it's very tight, we actually get higher CO2 levels, and that's why we tend to fall asleep. And so that's why you want to have air circulating, because we actually use up enough of the oxygen and input the CO2, because we're the reverse, right? We're consuming oxygen and producing CO2. Plants are the opposite.
So you're going to be smarter in the greenhouse?
I don't know if you're going to be smarter. You might be a little more awake.
So, okay, among the other things in praise of trees, they protect our drinking water.
Absolutely.
How do they manage that?
So if we think about surface water, they're going to keep the soil in place. They're going to absorb pollutants with their roots and nutrients, and they're going to protect this ground on which the water runs over to get to the reservoirs. So if you think about in Rhode Island, we have the Situate Reservoir, and you want to have trees around it. You don't want bare soil near that reservoir, because you're going to get erosion and you're going to get material into the reservoir. And so all of the reservoirs you're going to see in this region where we are forested are going to have trees around them, and they're going to work hard to protect the health of those trees.
Now, are there some trees that are better at that than others as far as cleaning water or protecting our water supply?
Often they use conifers because they don't want the leaves to go in the water. That can be problematic in the sense of you've got to have native species. So most of the reservoirs now that you see around this region are going to have native species, the hardwoods that we find in the area.
Now, flooding. They mitigate flooding.
They do. They help, again, keep the soil able to absorb lots of water and not let it run off. They also transpire the water, right? So they take water out of the ground and transpire it, meaning it's being evaporated to the atmosphere, so the soil can hold more water.
Right. And And they improve our mental health, right?
Well, at least for some of us, absolutely. They calm us. I think most people find being around trees, being around nature is very calming and helps you. So I think we would think about it not so much trees, but having a natural environment around us. There's lots of evidence to show that makes you in a much better mental state.
People done studies on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so
a lot of work on that.
And the idea that if you're in a natural environment surrounded by trees, you're just going to be a little more chill than you might have been?
Yeah, you're going to have a little more equilibrium. And of course, the real key is it's cooler.
Right.
So you want to have the trees in this environment where we get warm summers. If you have trees around your house will be much cooler. Your energy use is much less. And on a day like today we are having, it's quite windy outside. If you have trees around you, that will break that wind.
And is it? So where the southern exposure gets all that sun, is there any, if you're planting trees around your house, is there a place for cooling purposes that you'd rather have the trees in the southern side, or?
Well, yeah, certainly. You want it where the sun's going to strike the most. In the urban environment, again, it's where you can grow them, because if you have a larger lot, then you want to put them more on the south side. Now, the one conflict we now see is if you want to have solar. Of course, if the trees are absorbing the sunlight and blocking it, your solar panels aren't going to work as well. So there's often a tension there now of trying to allow the sun to get to the solar panels if they're on your roof, and then maybe have the trees a little further away. But you can't have both.
Right,
or not effectively.
And I've heard people say that the worst thing you can do is cut down a forest for solar.
Yeah, we don't want to use a forest area and convert it to solar. I don't know if it's the worst thing, but now you're trading, right? You're getting in a way you're getting behind, because you're taking all of that carbon that is in the forest and the carbon it can additionally absorb, in order to reduce the carbon from burning fossil fuels. And that's a kind of, you're taking money out of the bank in order to make more money, so it takes a long time
now,
for that
idea
to happen.
of that carbon banking idea, like there's been many stories about peat as a carbon bank. But should we not have wood burning in our fireplaces? Should we not burn wood at all?
Well, we have to be careful. We don't want to cut the forest down just to burn the wood. But certainly if you have dead material, or if there are other reasons you're harvesting the forest to produce lumber, you can't always use all of it. So you want to use that excess to good effect, not just let it rot, but to burn it. Now you have to do that at the right interval, right? You don't want to so intensively harvest that you deplete the site. In this region, though, if you have an average rotation length, meaning how often you cut the forest, of 80 years, the data suggests that it's very robust. You can do that. You can use the waste wood, burn it to produce electricity with good filters, so we're not producing air pollution, and we're better off.
So you don't think it's a bad thing to burn wood and have a wood burning fireplace or whatever?
Well, a fireplace is different. A fireplace is different because it's very inefficient.
Right.
So the largest source of pollution that I personally breathe in the city is probably from neighbors and degrees fireplaces.
And I notice if you look at pollution maps of New England during the winter, you'll see in parts of Vermont where they're all burning wood, you'll see it's a dark color showing they're burning all that wood.
There are lots of valley systems in the mountains where ski areas and things where they'll ban burning wood for that reason.
Right.
Now the good news is modern wood stoves are double circulating and are much better at that of making sure you fully combust that material, so you get less of that particulate matter we talked about earlier.
And everyone talks about the Amazon as the lungs of the earth, and I'm sure they're not the only lungs we have. But
right.
But aren't trees renewable? I mean, is it such a tragedy that we lose a certain amount of the Amazon?
Carbon. It's about the Amazon, absolutely, because of all the carbon that's stored, and the fact that it's not just about oxygen, it's also about water. So they create their own environment. So it starts changing the hydrologic cycle, which affects rainwater, raining,
right.
And the hydrologic cycle. But we also have to recognize that of course they regrow, and no better place to look for that than where we live.
Yeah.
So New England was 80% cleared land 120 years ago. It's now roughly 80% forest land.
Right.
So
Wow.
every forest that you see in Rhode Island is a product of human disturbance. So you're seeing what I like to refer to as a cultural landscape. First, the native peoples who lived here interacted with the forest. They used fire. They used other means to manage the forest to their advantage. Then we got European settlers come in and clear much of that forest, most overwhelming amount in Rhode Island. Then we changed how we used the land. We got the forest to regrow, and now we have a lot of forest land.
And I understand there's even places what you could call wilderness in Rhode Island, where you don't see a road in a mile circumference or something.
So you wouldn't see a road, but I'm very careful in talking about it as wilderness. There's multiple definitions. These are still culturally defined forests. The species composition, the structure of the forest, the trees, and how they grow have all been affected by humans who've lived in close association.
And those stone walls you see as you're walking around through the
Absolutely,
woods.
we see stone walls throughout. And the fun part is we can travel. I can drive along these roads in a car, and I can tell you what the history of that forest is by the shape and structure of that forest.
Reading the landscape.
Reading the landscape, exactly.
And you're looking at the size of the trees alone, or no?
The size. Pardon?
The grouping of them.
Well, it's the species composition. It's the structure. Do they have limbs just high up? Do they have limbs lower down? The different species, the composition, the density, all of that tells us sort of what were the disturbances that came before. Were those grazers? Were there cows? Were they cut over? Was it previously cleared and it's just regrowing? All of that. Now, as we get further away from our agricultural past, those signs will get more opaque, but you can do it easily. Anybody can do it.
Interesting.
Wow, very interesting. And it will be even more interesting when we come back for the second segment of the Tommy Rocket Show, because we're a little bit out of time. So stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Joe Perry. And Steven Tyler from Aerosmith, here for RAD, recording artists, actors, and athletes against drunk driving. Never let someone you know get behind the wheel if they've been drinking. Friends don't let friends drive drunk.
Hi, and welcome back to the second segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. As you know, we're here with Peter Phipps and Steve Hamburg. Peter, where are we going with this?
Well, we were just talking about we were praising trees, and I think now we're thinking is that we'll talk about planting and caring for trees. So you've planted probably thousands of trees in your life?
Probably not thousands, but 1,000 trees, yes.
Easy. And much of it is in the city, or do you ever do forest planting?
Well, it's interesting because actually I don't want to plant trees in the forest. Natural regeneration actually is incredibly powerful. So if we think about the forests that are around us here in New England, 99% of those were never planted. That's natural regeneration.
From fires or storms or something?
Well, animals spread seeds, birds sell them, and chipmunks, everything, and it's far more robust than if we plant them. Now, you want to plant it if you want apples or you want fruit, so I have planted apple trees on my piece of property where in the forest where I cleared some land so I could have fruit trees. But yeah, it's a far more, and people think that they need to aid in the forest getting reestablished. Very few places in the world. There are some where you have to do that, but that's the rare exception. What you really have to do is say, why isn't there a forest here? And get whatever's keeping it, which might be cows or grazing animals or an exotic species, deer, that are preventing it. And you have to remove that stress, and the forest comes back beautifully.
Really?
Now, so the planting you've done, much has been city planting.
They have street trees.
Right. So,
Are those certain types of trees or just?
yeah,
Well, they're
we
a wide range.
Right.
Yeah.
So some work and some don't. don't. Some push the sidewalk up, some...
Well, some are not. Remember, the urban environment's a stressful place for a tree.
Right.
You've got air pollution, you've got salt,
Yeah.
You've got water limitations often. You might have physical things like cars and people breaking them, which they do.
Right.
So you want to match the environment with the tree, just like in nature selects, right? Not every species grows everywhere. It's got to be the right climate, and we have to do the same thing in the urban environment.
So if you're in an urban environment like Providence.
Like Brown University.
Like Brown University, I live very close to Brown University.
Now,
We
Brown
plant
has some
trees.
open spaces, though. It's a little easier, right? More like...
Well, but on the street trees now.
Right, the
so we're
street
talking about
trees.
we want to bring those trees right out to the street because they modify the climate, they cool it, they're aesthetically pleasing, they slow the cars down. There's lots of evidence to show if you put street trees, people drive slower.
Because...
Really?
Just it's a feeling a little more enclosed rather than it's open.
I see,
It's not a drag strip.
So it's not the highway.
It's not the highway.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. But they don't live that long, city trees, right?
Oh, they can.
Yeah.
They can live. So I've planted trees in the east side for the last quarter century, and 90% of them are still alive, and they're growing well. And I would expect the average age of the trees we planted, which we take care of, initially to get them started, I would think the average age will be at least 75 years.
Really?
Now, when they get to be that maple tree in its 50th year, and they're pushing up the sidewalk and they're doing all these things, is there a time in which they don't work anymore, get to a certain size?
No, they work. The key is they won't push up the sidewalk nearly as much if you plant them correctly and give them a proper planting bed, a pit, an area where you've cleared the sidewalk and stuff and allow them to root effectively.
So they go down and up.
They go down and out. Now, some trees will push it up more, and when that does happen, that certainly happened in front of my house, there's ways that you can actually replace that without killing the tree. Either you can have a mound or just simply pulling it up and redoing it a little more effectively. Unfortunately, a lot of times people come in and think they've just got to cut all the roots off, and of course that damages the tree and then it gets unhealthy and it'll die, as opposed to working with the tree. The key is you want to work with the trees.
So in the city, in Providence and Cranston and Pawtucket, there's some trees that aren't good for the city, right?
Absolutely.
And they're all over the place, right?
Like what kind?
Like what's...
Well, so the problem was we used to plant a variety of Bartlett pear, I could say, Bradford pear. Bartlett's the one we eat. Bradford pear.
Which have stunted fruit, or...
Well, it's not so much the fruit. What happens is they split a lot. So you'll see, and that was unfortunately a very common tree. We shouldn't plant the pear trees at all. They're not really a good city tree. They're very common. We really should get away from those.
They're ornamental.
They're ornamental. They get larger. They have beautiful flower, sort of spring flowers. People like them, but they're not an effective street tree because as they get larger, they split. They create a lot of damage. Just not a good street tree. You want things that are preferably native, though not all of them are, because we're trying to plant in an urban environment, which is not where they evolved. And you want ones that provide, if you're a street tree, you want to get them up and out, right? You don't want the branches hitting people or hitting trucks.
Right.
So you want them up, you want to create a canopy.
Right.
For those places where it's very narrow, you want a columnar shape so that, they don't spread out.
Yeah.
But often they can over the road or whatever.
Right.
So you got to pick the right species. You also want diversity because we have pests. Unfortunately, we have the emerald ash borer. We're not unique. They came from Michigan and it's come right across to the East Coast. So the ash trees that were heavily planted 30, 40 years ago, they're threatened. You can treat for them. We're not sure how effective that will be, but almost 90-something% of the ash between Michigan and here has died.
So what does an ash tree look like? What's the bark like?
Mountain ash?
Well, no, mountain ash they are, but that's not what we get. We get green ash as most of the street trees in this area, but you have white ash and also in the forest. It's got a kind of furrowed bark, and it's a compound leaf, and it was favored. I mean, the problem we had in Providence a quarter century ago is they were growing in Roger Williams Park the pear trees and the ash, and so we had very little diversity because that's what we were planting in the city. And the challenge is the pear trees now have run their life life, and they're splitting and breaking and creating all kinds of problems. And the ash trees are now subject to a couple of different diseases, but the emerald ash borer is just, it kills everything. Now, you can treat them, and the city's treating them. We treat them in our area, but it's a real challenge. So we really want diversity.
Right.
So on our block, because the city forester we worked with for a long time, really had fun. So we have 25 species of different street trees on our one block of Lloyd Avenue.
Do you?
And
So
and that
give me a sampling.
Oh, we have London plane, and we have several kinds of oaks, and we still have one Norway maple, and we have a couple of different varieties of cultivars of elms, and we have, what else do we have? We have Zelkova. We have
Zelkova?
Zelkova. It's a kind of Siberian elm.
Oh.
It's a relative.
Are there sycamore trees on your block?
Well, mostly we don't have sycamore. We have London plane. So sycamore is the native species. It's subject to a fungus, but you can do a hybrid with the plane tree to get the London plane, a very robust urban tree. You go down to New York City, you'll see it. They really have the most. They're really effective. But like anything, we don't want too many of one thing.
Because
we could get these diseases that come through. It wiped out all the elms. Around Rhode Island, all the cities in the Northeast had elm trees, and we just had this mass loss. And then we planted Norway maples across the way. And while they were great, they're an exotic. They did well at first, and then with time they didn't do so well. So you see them, they're breaking and they're brittle. And
all that is to create that cathedral effect that the elm gave you on the street, right? That's why they went to Norway maple, I suppose.
Well, the
right?
Norway maple did some of that, but you can get that with a variety of species, and that diversity really, it's good ecologically. It's much more resilient, because if you get these pests and bugs, you're much less likely to get full loss. You might lose everything, and it gives you a very interesting place, and from a standpoint of birds and. Right. It's great.
Now, you talk about elms. Would you say the last significant stand of elm trees are those trees at Brown in Rhode Island? Are there others?
I don't know. That's a great question. There are numerous. I see clusters of elms in different places, but they were largely eliminated. Those who've worked hard to put the fungicides and protect them. We saw it at the Brown house. I've forgotten which one.
The John Brown house. They had
next
concert under the elm.
Exactly, and
they're gone.
They're gone now, but only recently, right? They persisted. They were gorgeous.
Right.
And then they lost them, unfortunately. And I think there's one left or something. But yeah, so with time, we're going to lose them all probably. Right. They're not going to make it.
They're beautiful trees.
They are. There are hybrids now that try and breed in resilience, resistance to the Dutch elm disease, and they're having some good luck with it. But I wouldn't count on it. That's why we include those. We have them as street trees. It's great to plant them. Just don't count on them making it, so you want to have other
Why
trees.
are there so many grafted trees in my neighborhood at Fox Point? There's a stump is one thing. I mean, the roots are one thing, and then there's this bulbous circle around where the tree comes out of the ground, and it's another tree on top.
Well, so that's in the case of trying, again, we have this tough environment, living in an urban environment, particularly, let's say, Fox Point College, where it's very compact, there's not a lot of open space. So you want to select for the most robust root stock and the most robust above ground.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily come together. So you graft them, and you get a viable tree. So they're the same species, they're just different varieties with different characteristics to give us an effective root structure and an effective above ground.
But is that the best way to go?
It can be.
Yeah.
It can be.
Seems
and there's
like
nothing wrong with that. It's just we're just helping along creating the characteristics that are going to live in this highly human-dominated environment.
Which is not native to these trees.
No, I mean, the trees didn't evolve in urban areas, and so we're trying to find ones that are going to work there well, and that's really the goal here. Is again, we're trying to bring nature in closer association with where we live, because we understand there's so many, as we talked before, so many benefits, both psychologically and physically, to us and to the environment. It also reduces the runoff to the bay, because we don't want the water just to rush into the bay. We want it to run more naturally and slower. So we want to make it less what we call it flashy.
I wanted to ask you about invasive trees, which trees are invasive, but we're running out of time, but I'll get back to that in the third segment. So if you stay tuned to the Tommy Rocket Show for the third segment, we'll be back with Peter and Steve. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Alicia Silverstone with PETA. When it comes to animals, there's no need to be a classroom cut-up. Use your right to refuse to dissect frogs, cats, pigs, even worms. Contact me at PETA for information on exciting, humane alternatives to dissection. They'll help you make the grade without using animals. Remember, biology is the study of life, not death. Thanks.
Hi, and welcome back to the third segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. We were discussing invasive species and what are they? It's just a quick question. What is an invasive tree? What does that mean?
So that's something that wasn't in the environment previously, that when it's introduced will start spreading rapidly. Sometimes there's a delay, but the point is they'll spread.
And what is the danger?
So the danger is that it'll dominate the system and make it hard for the native species to survive. In some cases, the plants, the animals associated or the insects won't be well adapted to it. And other cases, it'll just outcompete it. So you won't get regeneration of the native vegetation, and it shifts the composition of the forest, often eliminating species that you care about.
So biodiversity suffers. And
biodiversity can suffer. It can also, just change the system, change the soil, change the canopy, and all of that can have very negative effects.
So the tree root system can change the soil?
Absolutely.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
well, so invasive gets a bad rap, right? Do you think it's fair?
Well, yeah, I think it is fair in the sense that we have to be really careful, because what will end up happening, so for anybody who's planted bamboo, you'll know it's really hard to control, and it'll dominate the system. And now all of a sudden, it's fun, but you have to be careful, because now you're going to have a bamboo forest, and it's going to be hard to grow anything else.
Do they change the soil too, bamboo?
It'll change the soil, and in this case, it just spreads, and it's very aggressive.
Unbelievable.
And so we have to be careful. And the classic example is kudzu, which is a vine in the South, and that was introduced in the 1930s by the U.S. government, well-intentioned. They were having trouble with erosion. You had these very depleted soils in a lot of the areas that grew cotton and tobacco, and they wanted to stabilize it. So great, kudzu from Asia is going to grow well, and so they introduced it. What they didn't realize is it was going to just take off, and it grows right up on the trees, and it'll kill the trees, and it has a very detrimental effect. It's all the way up to Connecticut. I don't know if it's ever gotten to Rhode Island. It's been documented in Connecticut already.
Is it a vine?
It's a vine. Oh. But the point was, it was well-intentioned, but it's a very invasive species. It changes the ecosystem dramatically and lead to a lot of negative effects.
Is kudzu the one that wraps around like this?
It doesn't wrap around, it just covers it over.
I see, yeah.
Bittersweet might be what you're thinking about that runs around. That's another invasive.
Now, what about the chestnut tree?
Yes.
So the chestnut was a native, a very dominant native in this part of the world. And there was a blight that was introduced from abroad, and it killed all the chestnuts in a relatively short period of time at the beginning of the 20th century. And we'll remember the chestnut was a food source, certainly for the native peoples who lived in this part of the world for thousands of years. And it was an iconic tree. You hear about the chestnut boards and the old houses and all of that. So a lot of people want to bring the chestnut back. And we do have a lot of chestnuts, actually, chestnut trees in Rhode Island. Most people don't realize it. So, it got killed. But what happened is the fungus kills the above ground portion, but the roots survive and it resprouts. But as soon as it gets a couple inches diameter above ground, the fungus comes back, infects it, it dies back. back and it resprouts. So there's I don't know how many there, but I would be shocked if there weren't 10,000 chestnut trees in Rhode Island, but most of it's below ground. People want to bring them back through hybrids that breed resistance to the fungus and plant them. The challenge.
Where does the fungus come from?
I'm trying to remember. I think it was from Asia. It was imported. It wasn't native, and it was brought in, and the trees were subject to it. As we saw, you bring a new disease in, right? We saw it with COVID. We see it with. We don't have an immunity for it. Or unfortunately, the tragedy of all the diseases that were brought by the Europeans to North America, and it killed such a large proportion of the people who lived here because they had no immunity to it, and rapidly spread through the communities and killed them. Well, it's no different with trees. You bring in a pest or an insect or a disease that they're not used to, it'll spread quickly. And we have that now with a pest here in Rhode Island, the emerald ash borer, that's devastating the ash trees.
But what if there's something in oaks too, no?
Yeah, there are also oak blight, and there's the winter moth attacking the oaks that's having a big impact.
And have we ever had any success dealing with these?
Oh yeah, we do. You can have things that attack it, so that there are some that you can sort of hold at bay. Also, sometimes natural resistance will develop. So you do. It's not always a death sentence for the species, but sometimes it is.
What trees do we have in Rhode Island that seem to be without pests, without diseases?
Nothing's without pests. It's thinking about what humans live without diseases and without that. There are things that attack it because it's an opportunity. The question is sort of which ones are more robust and hardier, and in what environment. So we talked about the urban environment. Well, if we go out into the rural areas, you're going to have, it's a very different environment. So for example, sugar maple, one of our iconic species, does really well in rural Rhode Island, but it's not going to do as well in the city. It's very salt intolerant. So it can grow in the city, but it's less tolerant. So sugar maple is a common one. There are lots of, the oaks are very robust overall, but again, when you get these pests that come in, they're subject to impact. I mean, that's going to always be the case, and that's always been the case. We know from the record going back to the last glaciation, we've seen declines in species that come with pest outbreaks.
So if we had somebody here from what used to be called Narragansett Electric, they would have a different take on trees because their wires are all in the air.
Correct.
What's the answer? Put the wires underground, right?
Well, certainly you could put them underground, but also prune smarter. So we often think that we want to cut the tree dramatically, but the tree responds by sending out lots of sprouts. And so it's a kind of Sisyphean task because you're fighting the tree. So they just want no trees, but that's not good for us either. So what you want to do, now obviously if you have really big power lines, you just have to keep the trees away. But a lot of the power lines that we see, we can actually, if pruned properly and maintained properly, you can have trees and lines together, and you can do it effectively.
And what's the trick there?
The trick is to think about what the tree, you have to think like a tree. How will it sprout and grow in response to the cut? It's a disturbance, right? It will respond. It has all these little meristems, ability to sprout. Well, where will it sprout, and how will it sprout, and how will it grow? A lot of the folks who cut trees aren't thinking that way. They cut it and don't worry about what they'll respond. You want to basically get the tree to do what you want it to do, which is in this case go around the wires with good strong branches so that they won't interfere with the wires.
And one of the problems, I suppose, with some species of trees like the Norway maple is when a big storm comes, they crack and break.
Yeah, so you want things that aren't going to be brittle. And the Norway maple also is a problem, is it isn't well adapted to being a street tree. Ultimately, it was great when it was younger, and as they got older, they just weren't very robust in that environment. People didn't realize.
So how do you hold seminars with the people at the electric company, or what? How do you get the word out?
Well, I have spent some time with them, and it's usually not a calm relationship.
No.
But we've done pretty well. well. I mean, I can say that in our neighborhood where we work very hard to prune the trees and get them to that shape, I think in the 25 years I've lived in my house, we've had electric outages almost never.
Now, when you say we, you mean you encouraging the city to prune them correctly, or the electric company to prune them correctly?
I actually work on pruning trees myself, so we take responsibility for the ones that we plant and then prune them. And then if there's wires, you want to get them early enough to grow to the sides and up. And so you want to do that in a way that you get the right form appropriate for growing with wires.
Right. Now, what about climate change as a threat to trees? We talk about how important they are, but are they at risk like everything else that we hear about?
Absolutely. So the tree species that live in New England have been moving north and south as a climate change. So if we go back to the last glaciation, roughly the Wisconsin Glacier 10,000 years ago, it didn't look like this after that. Trees migrated as the climate changed. They always have. The very first scientific paper that I wrote about climate change impacts was the shifting distribution of red spruce in northern New England in a response to climate change. This was in the 1980s. We already saw a clear signal that the red spruce trees, which was the most important economic timber species in New Hampshire in the 19th century and into the 20th century, was shifting north. The species were not doing as well directly because of the warming. This was in the 80s, so we saw that effect already 40 years ago. We showed it quantitatively in data, and we're going to continue to see that.
And what did the timber companies do in result? They plant something else?
Well, they don't plant, remember. Our New England forests are not planted. We're getting natural regeneration. They shift to different species. So they cut all the red spruce. It was highly valuable, and that industry largely went away. You used other species.
And something else grew in its place.
Something else grew in its place, that's right. But we're seeing the impacts of climate change already on the composition of the forest. So in some plots that I established in the 1970s, I did very detailed records of what was growing and the upper canopy and the regeneration, all of that. And I knew because of climate change that things would change. Only 25, 30 years later, I started seeing the changes in those plots that I expected would be after I died. The impacts were dramatic, and that's why I actually left academia and started working directly on the impacts of climate change, because I realized that it wasn't just about talking about it. I wanted to actually be able to slow the rate of warming.
So that's why you're with the Environmental Defense Fund.
That's why
It's very honorable.
So it's like lobsters moving to Canada.
Absolutely. No, it's exactly the same thing. The distribution of lobsters is moving north because the water is getting warmer. It's not suitable for lobsters. It's no different for a tree. It will persist where it is because it can't pick up and move. It doesn't pack its bags and go. But it's regeneration. The saplings won't survive, or it'll get outcompeted by another species.
Wow. Wow. Well, we're coming close to the end of the segment. It happened very quickly, didn't it? But please stay tuned for the final segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. Thank you very much.
Young, who got some good minutes in the first half, hits the jumper. Tiffany Young, a junior from Hillsboro, Alabama, has 4. Young, 17-footer, got it. And Tiffany Young with a sensational performance.
Hi, and welcome to the fourth and final segment of the Tommy Rocket Show. As you know, we're here with Steve Hamburg and Peter Phipps. Peter, what were we just discussing?
Well, we were talking about roots, I think, and et cetera.
Climate change and how it's affecting
climate
trees.
Change
Trees
and
are
how
moving
we
north.
worry about trees,
Because,
and we care.
like lobsters.
And I wanted, like lobsters, and I wanted to end with like a sort of a sappy theme, and that is we're in love with trees.
Why is it that people are mesmerized by trees? What is it about them?
Well, I think it's the majesty. I certainly find that I'm just more at peace. So I have a piece. I'm lucky to have a little piece of land, a few tens of acres, up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, forest land. And for me, it's really important just to go and hang out and sort of commune with nature, to almost say something that's trite. And I find that I really do relax in that environment. The sort of the worries of the day, the things that were pressing in my mind.
The trees. And,
yeah, but it does, and it's, I don't tend to treat it as a place that somehow I have to kind of preserve, because I understand how dynamic it is. But what I do have to do is I have to respect it. So when I go up there, I want to hang out with it. I understand that people have been on that land for a long time, affecting it. I'm going to have my impacts, but I have to have respect.
What types of trees do you have on your land?
Oh, I have all kinds. I have sugar maples. So the area around my house, which I built, was an old sugar bush. So they were producing maple syrup there, probably maple sugar before that. But that hasn't happened probably for the last 100 years. But so it's dominated by sugar maples, but I also have hemlocks, I have red spruce, I have beech trees, yellow birch. I have a pretty wide diversity of trees. This is an area, unlike we talked about, that's never been cleared. The area around my house has never been cleared. The lower portion of my property has been cleared, so it's the exception, not the rule for forests.
So it's called an ancient forest, or what is it called?
It's not. So it's not an initial forest, because it had been cut. So there's very little of the sort of primary forest, as we call it, uncut and just responding to the environment around us, which is still influencing it in terms of climate and acid rain and things like that. But it was cut, but it was never disturbed. The soil hasn't been disturbed. Relatively speaking, it's a low disturbance until I got there and put my house in the middle of it. But I tried to keep my footprint small.
You always hear these things about tree huggers, and everybody loves trees, and trees communicate with each other, and they have this secret language. And is it possible that trees really do speak to each other?
Well, they communicate, absolutely, in that they send signals, but I wouldn't think of it as communication. It's not, hey, how you doing? But it's rather saying, I'm getting munched on by a bunch of insects. I'm going to let you know so you can build secondary compounds that'll make you less palatable.
Oh, really?
And the advantage is not that I'm altruistic, but it goes multiple ways. So they've evolved these signals so that it can reduce the overall impact on the species. And so that's just an evolutionary advantage of having that chemical signal. In very low concentrations, they emit them. The other trees are sensitive to it, and it causes the formation of these secondary compounds that make the leaves less palatable, which means they'll get eaten less, which means they'll reduce the impacts.
And so this brings up that book that a lot of people read, Hidden Life of Trees. But that argument is that this communication is done in the sort of neural network of the roots. Is that the way you see it happening? Or does it happen through the leaf crown and everything?
Well, so there are different connections. So what we're talking about, the insects, that's been well demonstrated, that show that there are compounds that have been identified that are given off by the tree and are picked up by other trees.
Through the roots?
No, through the air.
Oh, through the air.
And
so they have sensors in the leaves then, or something?
Right, so they're taking cues. Well, think about it, they're always taking cues. If you're a deciduous tree, your leaves aren't staying all the time. You're getting cues, day length, temperature. You're sensing the environment, light, because you don't want to keep a leaf. If you have a lot of leaves low down and you're getting really tall, they're actually a drain on the resources of the tree, because they're getting very little light. So they're not fixing a lot of carbon, but they're costing. You still have to respire, so they cost carbon. So there's all of these response functions that are part of the normal functioning of the tree. The roots interact. My actually graduate advisor wrote papers and did research on the interconnection of tree roots 70 years ago, just showing how they were connected and how there was exchange going on.
That's amazing.
And we also have to remember, most of the tree roots have fungi attached to them that are helping them. It's symbiotic. They're helping them pull in the nutrients, and they're leaking carbon, and that works for both organisms, and that's very effective. They are even mining. So some of those fungi are mining. They're dissolving primary minerals to get nutrients that matter, that phosphorus or calcium, depending on where you are and what's needed. that's helping this relationship work.
Now,
and that's been well demonstrated.
Now, one of the things that book by the German forester is that trees naturally exist in a forest, and that it's an unnatural setting for a tree to be a tree grew in Pawtucket or something. I mean,
well, that's not quite true, because if we think about it, fire has been an integral part of many forest systems. This area around here was fire naturally, and then it was exacerbated by humans. Clear forest, open it up. Trees grow in the open. They grow in forest, closed canopy. Both of those are natural, and humans are natural. So, and the trees have adapted. There's trees that do better in the open. If we think about the savanna systems, like in Africa, but elsewhere, we have them here in the U.S. as well. Not as many. Trees don't always grow in closed canopy forests.
Right. But you know, I come from a family of tree huggers, actually, who actually hug trees because you can feel them.
Their arm around
the wind
them
blows.
like this.
Yeah, my sister puts her arm around a tree, says, "Come on over," and you either listen to it or you feel it moving high up. So that's very.
Can you feel it moving?
I think
You can feel trees moving, and if there's wind, you can often feel them moving, absolutely.
So it's sort of
Really?
It
responding.
depends how big it is, and it depends on how much wind there is.
You can sort of. So it's sort of.
No, you can feel because they bend, right? There's sort of different strategies, evolutionary strategies. So some are going to be very rigid, which means when the wind gets heavy enough, they snap. Others bend, and then if they bend too much, they actually do go over, and you get a tip-up mound.
Right.
So the roots just break off. And these are all different strategies. Some are what we call determinate, meaning they have a dominant that goes straight up. Others are indeterminate that go out like this. They're just different evolutionary strategies for occupying the space you're in and exploiting the resources that you have access to.
And then, of course, humans find the ones that work for them, and they're like, for example, that swinging on birches, the Robert Frost. Now, those birches are probably skinny like that because they're not getting enough sunlight or something.
Well, but they also, birches tend to be an early successional species. They're going to grow early and trying to grow faster
Early
and
in
get
the
the
spring.
light. No, not early in the spring, early in following a disturbance.
I see.
So they're going to grow up, and you have different birches that they're often fast growing, and they don't live that long.
Right. I see.
The skinny white ones that you see.
So the gray birches that come in after old fields are the white birches, and then you have the yellow birches that come in after disturbance with logging, which is a little different. They'll grow on top of the dead log or grow on the top of the tip-up mound of that bare mineral soil.
Yeah.
So you'll often see them in the forest with their kind of legs up.
Yes,
There's a hole in
yes.
it. That's because underneath them was a dead log before. That rotted,
Right.
and then the roots are like that. And
now mice
that's,
live
you see
under
that in
there.
the forest. Yeah, there are lots of things that can live in it. These are, again, think of them as different strategies. They all have different strategies to exploit the environment. And depending on how the environment changes the disturbance, they're different composition of the different species.
Wow.
And that's the fun, going out in the forest and thinking about this as a system, a complex system, and understanding it and seeing the beauty and the magnificence of these multiple strategies and the complexity. That gives you a kind of reverence. As my father used to talk about, going up in the mountains and sitting was just being one with nature.
Right.
And just realizing how little we are. And there's some humility that brings to us to recognize these dramatic forces that we live among, and that not to have the hubris that we're all important. To me, that's why I like going in the forest, is to be able to be there and recognize I'm a small cog in a very large system, and don't take it all too seriously.
Now, you have your spots in your life. We've heard about New Hampshire and your street and on the east side. But what are 5 or 6 places that if you just want to see a wonderful, exquisite, spiritual tree experience that you would go in Rhode Island?
Oh, in Rhode Island.
Or close by.
Yeah, I don't actually know that I have them. I think everybody has their different ones, and it's really what...
For you.
Yeah, no, I get it, but I'm not sure I have 5 specific. I mean,
All right, well, you have your street.
I have my street.
You have your backyard.
I have all of my street trees that are my kids, right? I know the history of each one. You know, I planted that one. We planted that one 20 years ago, and this happened to it, and somebody broke it off or whatever happened to it.
Right.
And then they're just in the urban environment, some of those grand old copper beaches that people see with the big old houses.
Yes.
Those are not native. They came from Europe, but they're magnificent trees, right? And they need to be respected. They're just really wonderful organisms. And then going out in the woods where it's just more natural, right? That there aren't the stone walls, the places that didn't get the heavy clearing. There are fewer of them in Rhode Island. Or the wet areas. You go down to the swampy areas in the southern part of the state where you still have trees, but they're coping with wet feet, as we refer to it, right? So that's a different environment. It's really about recognizing those different environments as opposed to, a specific place. I just think about the parts of the world where I've gone and how different. I had the privilege of spending time in remote Mongolia in the north where there are trees, and how different environment that is. Or down in Costa Rica in the tropical forest where we've done work. And again, it looks different. But we have to remember so much of this has human imprints, and not to divide the world into the natural and the unnatural, but rather to think about it as these are evolving systems, humans are in it. How do we live in harmony with them, rather than saying somehow we have to respect it and that nature is separable from us? It's not.
At the same time, you don't want to put up a parking lot.
You don't want to put up a parking lot, right? But you don't have to treat it as somehow, just hold it off, but rather respect it and recognize how do we live with it.
Words couldn't have been better said. Steve, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. I can't tell you. And Peter, this is your idea, so you get a lot of credit for this. And I want to thank the guests of the Tommy Rocket Show for tuning in, because this was a great show. And I hope maybe we could do something again soon, because I'm sure there's much more to talk about, correct? Thank
Absolutely.
you, Steve. Thank you, Peter. And thank
Tommy.
you. Thank you very much.